Hi, Leisha. Thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, I'm so excited to be here and chat.
Yes, we're going to talk all about hormones. We talk a lot about hormones on the podcast, but we haven't necessarily got into specifics on things you can do in your diet and how to eat for your hormones. So I'm excited to share this information. I know we have a lot of women listeners that really struggle with figuring out their hormone imbalances, really. But before we dive into some of it, could you just tell us a little bit about kind of what got you into this specialty?
Yeah, definitely. So I started out as a nurse in the hospital, and I worked in the hospital about 10 years in between when I was in nursing school and when I was actually a nurse. And I worked all over the hospital. I worked on some kind of like general floors. I worked in the ER. I worked in the ICU a little bit. I got a lot of experience different places. And I really went into healthcare because I wanted to help people, like so many of us do. And I was just seeing that I didn't have the time and the essentially like, I don't want to say attention span, but like there was just so much going on as a nurse when when you have multiple patients, like you're just called back and forth between different essentially emergencies all day long. And I was just seeing these patients coming back again and again because I worked in, a town hospital that we were seeing the same people. Sometimes you know them when they came back. And so it's like, I'm seeing these people come back and they're getting sicker. And when we're looking at the nutrition that they were given, when we're looking at even like the nutritional guidelines that we send them home with in their discharge paperwork, I'm like, there's so much missing here. And not only was I not really able to spend the time helping them, I also didn't really even know quite what to tell them different other than I know this isn't right, right? And so with that being said, that really gave me some incentive to start doing my own research, changing my own health, changing the health of my family. And as I started to do that, I realized it was such a passion for me. And so I went back to get a certification in functional diagnostic nutrition, and I've gotten several other certifications since then. And really just came to this place of realizing like I wanted to help women be better moms, be better wives, be the people they wanted to be. And this thing that was keeping them back so often was energy and bad periods and bad mood swings where they just were not feeling like themselves. And so that's when I started to focus on hormones. And yeah, that's kind of the in a nutshell story.
Yes. And you made a really good point because it's something that I saw a lot too, where they keep coming back. So, in our conventional model, we're treating something acute and you like are treating it at that time or you're putting a medication, but it's not necessarily making you better. It's just really, I always say band-aiding sometimes the problem. But that I like how you said that. It was interesting that they're coming back over and over because you're really not making the changes in lifestyle and, really getting to the root cause.
Right. Right. And so much of the time, even like I would say probably they weren't actually following even the hospital's dietary things that they were sending home.
Yes.
But even that, I was seeing like, this is a problem, right? The diabetic diet is just like 1,800 calories of pasta and soda instead of 2,500. Like it was just a problem. And
Mm.
so, yeah, there was so much there that I was like, I want to get on the other side of this. I want to get ahead of this and be able to help people not get to this point.
Yes. Yeah. Well, that's great. So let's dive in because I know that you said your specialty is hormones. So let's dive into some of the hormonal imbalances that you see most often when you're working with nutrition.
Yeah. So when I have women come to me, often I've already kind of mentioned some of the symptoms that they see the most. And a lot of times it's really low energy, whether that's like energy crashes throughout the day, energy crashes throughout the cycle, just not being able to wake up in the morning, even sometimes not sleeping well, kind of all of those things around energy. Feeling really hangry sometimes, just like having these like mood swings throughout the day, but then also definitely swings throughout the cycle, especially that last week of the cycle when PMS comes up so often. And something that they've told me so often is just like, I don't feel like myself. Like, I feel like I'm not the person that I want to be that week. And I feel so out of control with it. And then sometimes it's also really painful periods. And so having a lot of cramping with your period, heavy bleeding, sore breasts, headaches, acne, all of those things, so much of the time we're told are essentially like, well, it's just being a woman sucks, too bad for you kind of thing. Or we're told you need to take birth control. Like that's the only way to fix it. And I just adamantly don't believe that that's the truth because I've seen it again and again. Like I can prove to you that it's not the truth. Um, and I see so many women stuck in those patterns. And I think that a lot of it is because we're told, oh, that's just normal, right? Periods have to suck. Too bad for you. Don't you wish you were a man? Essentially. So those are the hormone symptoms that I see a lot of the time.
Okay, and I agree. It's really finally the conversation's happening where you don't have to have that happen every month. That's not just the way it is. So it's good
Mhm.
to see that conversation finally start to change a little bit.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So what would you say you have mentioned some common mistakes that you see when it comes to hormones and what would you say are some common traps people fall in?
Yeah. So I think that first off, what I've already mentioned, just like feeling like it's normal and feeling like you're stuck. So if you feel like it's normal, then there's nothing to do about it, right? You just are stuck with it. And so that's the number one thing is creating that awareness that it's not normal. And then from there, I see women go into kind of like all of the rabbit trails so often, which is so easy to do on social media, so easy to do when you Google things, and just be like, okay, well, I must need to do keto. I must need to do intermittent fasting. I must need to do paleo. I must need to restrict. That's usually the first mistake that I see is finding a like pretty restrictive eating plan without necessarily having lab work done or working with a practitioner or something that's like a true guidance into this may really be the best thing for you because you have insulin resistance or because your cortisol is off or because of these different things. Um, I just believe that we've been taught so much in diet culture that if something is wrong with our bodies, because our bodies are telling us, there's symptoms here, something's going on, their body is trying to communicate with you. If something is wrong, then we must need to restrict. We must need to cut things out, whether that's food, whether that's, activities, whatever it is. Like we've got to cut things out to get better. And so that restriction mindset, I would say, is one of the biggest things that I see as a mistake because it only gets more and more. Like when you start to restrict certain foods, then often it's like, okay, well, that worked for a little while, but it's not enough. So now I also need to restrict this other food, or I need to restrict my calories more, or I need to exercise harder. And it's that like restriction and kind of like punishment mindset that this is the only way to like beat your body into submission, essentially, when really like your body is working with you, your body loves you, you are your body. And so being able to look at it more from like a big perspective of like, how can I give my body what it needs instead of how can I take away all the things that might be bad?
Hmm. And I see that it's interesting that you pointed that out because I do see a lot of women come to me and saying that they are struggling to lose weight. And then I actually have them add food and they're so surprised
Mhm.
because I'm
Yeah.
like, you're actually not eating enough. And it's like, but I'm trying to lose weight. And but I'm like, you're not making progress because your calories are so low. Then your body starts to conserve and you're actually kind of it's backfiring. And I think that's because of that diet culture that we've lived in for so long. That's a really hard concept for a lot of people to really understand.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the biggest thing that I usually see when I start working with my clients and we start doing some food tracking is like you're surviving on nothing essentially, or the foods you're eating are not nourishing. And so your body still doesn't have the nutrients that it needs. I would say 99% of the time, they're not getting what they need. And that, of course, is a huge trigger for stress in the body. And stress in the body, when your adrenal glands are being told there's an emergency, you're going to prioritize cortisol production and you're going to deprioritize or even use your progesterone to make more cortisol. And so it just creates this pattern of not safety in the body. And so when you can start actually eating enough food and eating consistently, those are the two things that I always recommend first to support hormones, because the more you can tell your body things are safe, the more your body can say, okay, it might actually be safe to produce hormones now. It might actually be safe to be okay with having a baby. And that doesn't mean, of course, you have to get pregnant by any means, but that's essentially what your body is trying to protect you from. Because if you don't have the resources you need, you don't have the resources for a baby. And so it's just that like very clear line that your body sees and is just trying to help you survive in whatever emergency situation it senses that you're in.
Yeah, and the cortisol increase will create that belly fat. So then I think a lot of women
Mhm.
are, upset by the belly fat, but that's actually again a protective mechanism for your organs when you feel like you're in
Mhm.
fight or flight. So it is amazing how there's purpose for all of these things that happen in our bodies. It's just be understanding why and when and what should happen. And you brought up another good point of social media. Everyone's out there saying what worked for them. So there's so many people out there talking about, we'll do this, we'll do that, that's what worked for me. But I just find that everyone's so unique that it's different things work for everyone. And something that's working for you right now might not be what you need 6 months from now when you have a different shift. But it's really acknowledging where you are and what you need at the moment too.
Right, right. Which is why I think it's so helpful to have someone else's eyes on it for you, or even
Yes.
to have like that functional lab testing. Um, and I always say there are so many things that I do really believe are a baseline, essentially like across the board. But with that being said, a lot of times if those baselines are in place and you're not seeing progress, then that's where, the outside support is really helpful.
Another thing that I see with women too, and I was wondering if you see this a lot, is that the actually needing to increase protein intake. Sometimes, when we don't eat a lot of meat, if you're not like a huge meat eater, then finding ways to incorporate non-meat sources of protein into your diet can also be something that's helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, I do see that a lot when we look at macros. So we're looking at, overall calories first, or kind of at the same time, essentially. But we look at overall calories and it's like, well, yeah, you're eating like 12 to 1400 calories. So that's not enough for your body since you're an adult and not a 3-year old.
Yeah.
And a lot of times it is, what I see the most is actually that women have like a much higher fat macro percentage than they need compared
Mhm.
to protein. And so a lot of times it is that like that protein needs to increase, which ends up replacing some of the fat macros. And then that can help speed up the metabolism a little bit from there.
That's another interesting point because we're also shifting. So we lived in the diet culture of no fat, high carb. And so
Mhm.
then I think that it has swung the other way of
Yeah.
fats are good, fats are healthy, fat, which is, we needed to shift that because we need healthy fats. But now I think people are hearing that message of good fat, and if you're still eating carbohydrates too, which we do, in our diet, then that also, I agree, can backfire on you.
Mhm. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you're
That it really
adding.
has to be a little bit more of just an intentional balance, essentially.
Mhm. Yes.
But of course, like healthy fats are something that makes your hormones. Like you need
Mhm.
those, you need cholesterol to make your hormones. And when you're eating more of a like ancestral diet, when you're eating more animal products, you are going to be getting more fat. But there are little tweaks that you can make to just reduce that to a little bit more of a reasonable range. And
Mhm.
it just takes being aware again.
Yeah. Yeah. Like the one that I always think surprises people is like even avocado, because,
Mhm.
when you look at the portion size of an avocado, sometimes people will be like, well, I have avocado toast in the morning, and they're putting a whole half or a whole avocado on a piece of toast. And when you look at how much fat's in that avocado, while it's a healthy fat, is still, looking at the balance. So it's all those like intentional awareness. I definitely agree. Well, let's shift a little bit into some foods you would recommend specifically for hormone balance.
Yeah. So I always recommend the very first thing being looking at your food quality, along with that consistency and like making sure you're getting enough. But food quality is so important. And so much of the time, we're especially, pulling that diet culture mindset in again, a lot of times we're eating fake food because we think that it's healthier. And even I'm even talking about, like things that are organic or gluten free, but they're from a package. So much of the time when we're eating, we think we're eating healthy. If a lot of our foods are coming from those packages, we're still missing nutrients. And so I really like to go back to the most basic possible food where it's like you're getting really good quality, organic, grass fed, pastured meats, and you're getting the same thing for like your eggs and your dairy. If you tolerate dairy well, like making sure it's just like kind of the most pure form that you can find in your life, in your budget, where you live, all the things. and then adding in, like root vegetables and fruits as most of your carb source instead of grains as most of your carb source, especially those processed grains like, breads or crackers, even if they're gluten-free, there's still going to be a lot of additional ingredients in those most of the time, unless you're getting the cleanest brands ever. And so I like to look at that first, like getting your protein source and your carb sources together. Most of your carb sources coming from more nutrient dense things like those fruits and those root veggies, and then adding in antioxidant rich veggies as well, depending on your gut, how inflamed your gut is. Sometimes you need veggies that are cooked. Sometimes you can tolerate raw veggies. Sometimes you can tolerate greens. Sometimes you can't. Like that's going to depend on you and where you are right now, but really just like going back to those basics. And then when you are adding in grains, organic grains, like oats and rice and things like that, that are just like basic foods, and taking that as the main nutrient dense source of your nutrition. And then, of course, like there's going to be some processed foods in everyone's life. Nobody's perfect with that. I choose the best brands that I can. I try to not stick with convenience foods most of the time, but like you're going to get really far in your health over time when you're just changing the quality of your nutrients. So I really recommend that. And then just looking at, the percentage essentially of processed food versus whole food in your diet. And it does require more cooking at home, but it can also still be pretty simple. It doesn't have to be fancy. I think that's the main thing that I would really look at, because as moms and as women, most of the time we're kind of like the one in charge of that, whether we're doing all the cooking or not. Like I personally don't do all the cooking, but I pretty much do all the planning. Like it just ends up being me planning the food. And so sometimes just keeping it simple is actually the best thing for my hormones, because it's not like an additional stressor. And also I have kids, and I don't know about you, but I have noticed that kids are not like the best fans of fancy food either. And so it's another stressor off. It's like, okay, our food's pretty simple. Sometimes I make something that's like a little more fun or fancy, but for the most part, like if we keep it simple, it's less stress on me, which is great for my hormones. And my kids are less grumpy about it, which is also great for my hormones. So
Yeah.
I know that's not totally like specific foods, but that kind of like overall perspective can go a really long way. And then I also really like to look at mineral rich foods to make sure that your adrenals are getting what they need. You need minerals like potassium specifically, sodium specifically, calcium, magnesium, all of those main macro minerals. You need those for stress response. You need them for blood sugar balance. You need them so that your body can balance things like iron and copper. There's so much there that just those four main minerals are really important for. And you can supplement with them. And sometimes we need to because our foods are not nutrient dense enough. But there's a lot that you can get from your food. And so I like looking at foods that are potassium rich, which is a lot of like bright colored fruits. I like looking at making sure that we're getting really good quality salt. I like things like adrenal cocktails. Those type of things are foods that I would add in, because when we start to get those minerals, it's actually really incredible that our capacity increases as women. And so that's what I really love to see, is that like as you get more nourished, your capacity actually increases because your stress hormones go down and you can think more clearly and you don't have all the mood swings and all the things.
Yeah, that's great. And do you have any advice for busy moms, like tips? Because I know, like you said, the planning can be important, especially like, a lot of moms are now balancing their kids and their work. And I do hear often, like, I just don't have time. And so we're trying to create ways to make things simpler.
Yeah. It really depends on the season that you're in and like what's available to you. I will say, like, I have a pretty busy schedule and I prioritize making food a lot of the time. And again, I think it's just keeping it simple. So, depending on if you're like running out the door in the morning or not, think about how much time you actually have to make breakfast and what are that can fit that for your family. Sometimes it's yogurt and fruit for us, and that's great. And that's fast. Sometimes I make, a quiche ahead of time and that lasts us a few days for breakfast. Sometimes I just make breakfast. Sometimes I make eggs and potatoes in the morning. But it depends on the day and it depends on, if we're at home, how long we have to make it. I try to kind of make sure that it's not totally blocking out self-care in the morning for me. And so I think it's just going to really take a little bit of sitting down pen to paper. I actually have an episode on my podcast, Happily Hormonal, I'll have to get the number for you and we can link it in the show notes, but it talks about simplifying meal planning. I had a guest on who is so good at that. And so I will link that because that was really, really helpful. But I would just, again, it just goes back to like making a plan and then keeping it simple. There's some meal plans that I really like that are free from Cassie Joy Garcia. Her website is Fed and Fit. I recommend that all the time because she sends out a weekly free meal plan that is like whole food, has a grocery list. Like, I don't know how much better you can get than that. And
Hmm.
so sometimes you just do that on autopilot. I do sometimes where I just am like, okay, what's my meal plan? I'm going to see what Cassie says my meal plan is. And then I print it out and I go to the store and her meals are really good. So
Hmm.
I try to just go with, you know, I think the best advice that I have is planning ahead, doing your grocery shopping all at once, and then just making sure that it's actually realistic time wise for you. And looking at, like, for me, Tuesday nights, we have soccer practice with 2 kids. So Tuesday night is not going to be a dinner that takes me an hour. It's maybe going to be a crock pot meal. It's maybe going to be a sandwich. Like, it's going to be something more simple. And when I'm able to like look ahead at my week and make it a little more realistic, then I'm not as frustrated and we're not like caught off guard and blindsided by the fact that we had soccer practice that I forgot about. And then we're not, running through Qdoba or whatever.
Yes. And I was thinking about something that you said because I was working with someone, actually had an appointment yesterday with someone who was feeling like the meal planning just felt too overwhelming, like the rest, thinking of having to get a shopping list and make recipes, and she just felt like that was not something that was on her, she could handle on her plate right now. And then when we were talking through it, I was like, well, why don't we just take one thing, and why don't you just do your protein prep? Because sometimes with meats, like, you have to cook the meat, you have to have that. So when you're
You have
going
to have
to
it
on the
thawed.
yeah, like it does take some thought. So I said, well, why don't we just even think about what meats you're going to have for the week. She was saying kind of like once she starts her work week, she's really busy and doesn't get to do the meals. And I thought, well, even if you just take your proteins and you think of what protein you're going to have every day, and that's something that needs to be prepared earlier, and then you can find the vegetables and the grains and things pretty easily to come into it. So really focusing on what your bandwidth is can also be, and
Mhm.
where you feel comfortable. Some people are recipe people, some people feel like intimidated by recipes too, I feel like.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. I think that that's so good. And I love the kind of like modified food prep idea because personally, like making food prep containers for the week, that
Mhm.
feels really overwhelming to me. And like, I feel like I don't have time for that. I don't have 4 hours on a Sunday or whatever. And it probably doesn't even take that long, but that's what I have in my
Yeah.
mind. And so I really do like that. Sometimes on busy weeks, I'll do that. I'll prep 2 proteins. Maybe I'll also cook some potatoes or something like that. And then I have 3 dinners that have those things in them. And when I walk in the kitchen, I'm like, man, I really love myself from earlier in the week right now. Like, this is great. Right.
You're ready to go. Yes. I love that too. Well, can you give us one thing that you think can move the needle fastest when it comes to hormone balance?
That's a great question. I would just say consistency. And what I mean by that is making sure that you're getting food every 3 to 4 hours throughout the day. If you are not doing that, if you're already doing that, then I would say looking at the foods that are really going to support your hormones, like those mineral rich foods, those are really, really helpful. And then I talk about the carrot salad a lot. I don't know if you talk about that with your clients, but the raw carrot salad is something that I see really, really can help hormone symptoms, especially ones that come from high estrogen, like those painful periods and PMS and things like that. Um, the raw carrot salad recipe, if you just Google it, it's all over the place. But Ray Peat was the one who originally came up with it. And it's really easy to make. It's really good. And it can actually help support your gut health and your estrogen detoxification. And so I really like that one too. I think that, it is so hard to say like the one thing. And
Yeah,
I'm like,
I
the
put you on
one
the
thing,
spot.
the
Yeah,
seven
sorry.
one things. But
Yes.
but those are the things that I would look at, and it depends on where you're coming from.
Yeah, well, great. Well, thank you so much. You've given us such helpful information. And can you tell our listeners where they can find you?
Yes. So my podcast is Happily Hormonal. That's the place that I am the most. I also have, I am on Instagram a little bit and I'm at Leisha Drews. And I also have a website, which is leishadrews.com.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.